Welcome to our webinar about the psychology of a crisis. Has the pandemic changed us? And if so, how do we come out better? This event is organized by the European American Chamber of Commerce. My name is Yvonne Bendinger-Rothschild. I'm the Executive Director of the EACC in New York, and I will be your host and moderator for today's event. We have a Q&A function, and we encourage you to use it and submit questions to our panelists. Our panel will discuss how we can tackle the challenges and get beyond COVID-19, what we learned, and how that will allow us to innovate on new levels, and how we can bring everybody back together and come out of the crisis not only whole but better than we've been before. Our panel includes Thomas Brown. He's the CEO of Altius Advisors. Georges Huget, he's the chairman and CEO of Galileo Global Advisors. And Anish Melvani, the chairman and CEO of LVMH Moët Hennessy here in New York. And with that, let's get right into the discussion. The pandemic was very different from previous global crises that we, maybe not all of us experienced. When it comes to 9/11 is something that comes to mind, the 2008 economic crisis, but those crises had a distinct endpoint, and with that, it was much easier to, prognosticate, where we are, to look at where we are, analyze where we are, what happened, and then look ahead. So I want to start with a quick look back and just get some feedback from the panel on how did you experience the crisis? What were your first thoughts when you all went home on March last year? I can tell you I had a conversation with Tom, and what he recommended was to play, how did you put it, Tom? To plan my own funeral, which is what I did. I looked at our budget and I cut out all the members where I thought they could be a little bit iffy and may not be renewing. And then I hit the enter button and hoped that at the end of the day, I can still pay all the salaries. We were lucky. We were in a situation where we didn't have to lay anybody off. And we had an amazing support from our members, but not everybody was so lucky. And I would like to hear from the panel how you experienced the immediate onslaught of the crisis. I don't know, Anish, if you wanna start.
Sure. Look, I wish I could say that I was as prescient as Tom was in those early weeks of March. I thought this was going to be a few weeks, maybe 2 months at the outside. I had actually lived in Hong Kong in 2003 when the first SARS epidemic hit, and that experience. On the one hand, it was a weirdly familiar feeling. On the other hand, that ended relatively quickly in hindsight, and so I thought this is going to be really weird. It's going to be intense. Everyone's going to be locked down, but then they'll get a handle on it, and it will end. And it took a while for it to set in that it really was going to be a much longer slog. And to your point about the exercise that you did, as we looked across our businesses, on the one hand, some of our businesses adapted very, very quickly. Actually, I'll put it in 3 categories. On the one hand, some businesses were well suited to weather this. I'll take a business like Sephora that already had a very strong e-commerce platform with a lot of scale built into it. And so as everyone stopped shopping in stores and only could shop online, Sephora, was able to scale up their e-commerce business dramatically. That being said, with heroic efforts in terms of people at the warehouse to both keep the warehouses open and not get lots of people get sick. So that was one category. Another category would be brands like Vuitton and Dior that had to adapt very quickly, but were able to by taking some of the technology they built before, apps and things like that, that were used in store, and basically adapting them so that salespeople could use them at home and could be actually clienteling and interacting with their customers even while stores were closed. And we had stores closed for anywhere from 6 weeks to 3 months, and in Canada still have some stores closed to this point. And then the last category is companies like Starboard, which is our cruise ship retail, or Belmont with the hotels and the 21 Club in New York, where there is no playbook when the entire industry goes to zero, right? And you know, for a midtown restaurant like 21 Club, or for a business like cruise ship retail, it's been at zero for almost 1.5 years now. And so you know, unfortunately, when we put in the numbers into our spreadsheet and hit enter, it of course can't cover anyone's salaries. It can't cover anything because it's zero. And so working through how to, you know, navigate through that, what cuts you can, but also make sure you still have a business there when you come out of it, and having no idea when that would be, was a kind of unique exercise, something I've never been through. Hope I never have to go through again, but certainly learned a lot.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you, Josh. What are your thoughts on you know, how different that crisis is, and how you know, and on folks' reaction to it?
I think it's important to be candid. My first reaction was dominated by anger. Anger because I immediately understood that the consequences of the measures that were so extreme taken by the governments would have deep, long, and economic consequences. In my first block on the situation, I talked about the recovery in 23, and we're not very far from that. I was also angry because I don't like to be under house arrest. I am someone who travels a lot and meets people. I live on meeting people and meeting my team. And I still feel restrained there, even though I went to Europe and India in the beginning of the year, and I'm going to Europe next week. That being said, the most important thing was the team, and we're a small team. And what was important is to remain engaged. And the first thing that I decided is that we would have a Teams meeting 3 times a day, 9, 12, 4 o'clock, every single day. Even if it lasted 3 minutes, we had the impression to be together, be engaged, and exchange. And it was engaged, of course, on the business, but it was also being engaged on what was going on and how we felt about it. That helped us to manage. I am in the advisory business. And in the advisory business, my largest client basically dropped from the first days of the pandemic to zero. So exactly to what Anish was saying, it was a very daring situation. The way we did it is we decided to stay as a team. Everybody took a 20% cut, and I took a 50% cut to try to get through what could be done. So we took a personal sacrifice to be there. But because we were a team, when in June or July, 2020, it was possible for us to go back to the office. We decided to go 2 days a week, Tuesday and Thursday. And we have been doing that in person since then. So we have now 1 year of that experience. And we managed to get new clients, we managed to get new mandates, and so on. But the lesson is that the mix that every single person and every single company will have to use, and we will have to be very smart about it, and also very empathic about it, is going to be what I call a hybrid formula about what the importance of working at the office, knowing that at the end of the day, nothing beats the face-to-face meeting with a customer. Thank you.
Yeah. Tom, how did your clients react, and how many of them did you did you plan a funeral for?
Well, the reactions of the clients in our portfolio in some respects mirror the reactions that are being described by this panel and by yourself, Yvonne. There were some who were quite outraged by some of the extreme measures, which is similar to what George is describing. There were some who were really gripped by fear, which is, I suppose, closer to what you described, Yvonne. And then there were others in industries that weren't affected early on who assumed that this would be a flash in the pan. And we used the same approach with all of them, and it originated with those who were gripped by fear or lost in just outrage, but powerlessness about it. Because this premise of planning your own funeral, so to speak, it hails from behavioral science, where you take this uncertainty, where you don't know what's going to happen, and you convert it into manageable risk. So the exercise I recommended for you, Yvonne, was something that we did with many, which was just take the absolute worst case scenario. It sounds like perhaps that's what Anish did with his business. And you model that out. And it comes out to some number, right? It may be some very big negative number, but that is a manageable risk. You now know the dimensions, the contours, the parameters against which you must manage. That's the planning your own funeral. So that can be empowering. And so in some of our industries that we touch, hospitality, for example, it ended up being close to. In others, the reality played out in a way that was more favorable. But by having that funeral plan, so to speak, there was a game plan that brought people out of paralysis and into a place of action, so they could start inventing and doing some of the things like George described, where, okay, we've got to have some plan of action where we're interacting as a team, where we're planning for what happens when revenue comes back on, where we're capturing what revenue we can.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm hearing, I mean, one thing that that I took out of our conversation, I felt that going through the budget and doing that exercise empowered me. I felt initially when I went home, I was like, okay, so after the first, you know, you hand everybody a laptop, and then, you know, the first, you know, rush activity is taken care of. And then I asked myself, so what do I need to do next? And the exercise helped me focus what my options are, what the situation is, and it gave me what you just described as a manageable risk, something that I could put my fingers on and act against. But what I think is really important, and we did the same thing, what Josh just said, it's remaining engaged. And I would like Anish to start off with that, because you have a lot of engagement to handle in your role. You have the engagement with your maisons. You have the engagement with your staff at headquarters, but your staff. What were the number of your employees? 200,000. Do I remember that correctly? Or is it even more than that if you go down to the retail?
Well, we're globally, yes. In North America, we're about 30,000 employees, all the way including.
So you needed to come up with a message, and then, you know, how are you going to go through that? And I'm sure you engaged your employees in building that message. I seem to recall from our last conversation. So can you talk a little bit about that and see how you, you know, once you knew, you know, or at least had a grasp of what the situation may be, what were your next steps, and how did you engage everybody on the team, all the way down to the retail level, and also your suppliers? No, you had suppliers to work with.
You know, Yvonne, I think the way I would synthesize it is we had to figure out how to replace the thing that had been ripped away from everyone, which was human interaction. And, you know, fortunately, this occurred in a time where technology had progressed with the technology we're using now, that we had a passable substitute that really wouldn't have existed even a decade ago, not at the scale that we needed it. But what we did is we brought our leaders together of our largest maisons, and this is a group that if I was lucky, I could get them together once a quarter, more like twice a year. All of a sudden, we were all on the phone every week, because just having a group of colleagues to understand that we were all facing the same issues and to be able to kind of talk things through and then come out with a set of messages that allowed everyone to feel like they were part of something bigger than just the immediate team that they were on was a source of comfort. And I think that the calls themselves were a source of strength and comfort for the individual leaders. And then the output of those was a source of comfort for the broader audience. The second thing we did, because let's not forget, we had the pandemic trauma followed very quickly by a lot of social unrest and social justice trauma. And so the other thing that we discovered was how to use this mechanism to actually speak directly to our people at the front lines. And that, frankly, is something that I think we're going to take away from this whole experience. But we were able to get, 5,000 to 10,000 of our total employees just in North America to be connected to a webinar where we could talk about things like the murder of George Floyd, where we could talk about things like, what we're doing to keep our people safe, both from the pandemic and from, riots and things that were in and around our stores in some cities. But fundamentally, what we did was, first of all, come together so that people knew they weren't alone, and try to bring in some more of that human contact at a time when people were, in many parts of the country, not everywhere, but in many parts, really confined to only contact with their immediate families and households.
Yeah. Georges?
I would like to take a quick minute on my vision of where we are now and what has happened, actually. And if I can use an expression of a hub and spoke, and imagine that we are, each of us, at every individual, we have a hub, and we have a series of spokes. It can be culture, it can be sports, it can be restaurant, it can be the office, it is the family, and so on. And somewhere there was a balance before, where we were going to a series, and I use the word in a physical sense, locations, and we were somewhere even implicitly regulating the distance between the various elements. And then there was an explosion. The explosion is that the whole activity that we had before was confined to our home. And so, to a certain extent, the company was outside completely because we were not going there. We couldn't go to the theater, we couldn't go to those places. So now where we are is, having gone through that, we will have a unique opportunity to redefine what I call the social distancing of the various elements. And that will be a major challenge for corporates. In other words, when I hear CEOs of banks and so on saying, come back and that's it, no, that's not it. That's the beginning of the conversation, because we will have to be much more subtle. There are jobs that don't require physical presence. There are jobs that can be done hybridly. How much will the customers react? Will we have visitors and so on? So we are now in a situation where something that was our legacy, we will have to re-choose it. And quite naturally, we had dramatic situations in the families, but we also had people who decided they didn't want to go back to work or not to be in the same industry. So we are going to see now, and I think it's going to be crucial, we are going to see now a redefinition of who we are and who is important in this hub and spoke approach of what our life is.
Yeah, let me pick. I agree with you. This is still. I mean, we may get to a point where we are vaccinated at a 70% level across the U.S., but the U.S. is not an indicator for the rest of the world. And but before I get to the who we are, Tom, can you talk a little bit about what we defined as the PTSD post-COVID? Because I mean, you have when you have different age groups who are experiencing this differently. Younger people, you know, more mature or older executives. You have them. Each one of them has a different background. Maybe their own health issues. Somebody died. Then you know, I mean, you find yourself confined to a house where your husband may have died in. And all of those. How do you tackle this multitude and highly complex situation as a corporate executive? You know, when you're trying to bring the team together and provide, you know, as Anish said, comfort to everybody when the situations are that diverse.
Well, the language of PTSD is apt because anytime there is a traumatic event, there is a potential for lingering anxiety relating to that trauma. And you get into conditions like PTSD when that persists after the trauma has remitted. And so some of the scenarios you described, Yvonne, would fall within that. So what we advised our clients to do was to draw heavily on what the science shows us, which is whenever you have a traumatic event and there's residual anxiety, let's say you have an instance where the source of the anxiety has remitted, but people still have anxiety, for instance, without returning to work. You look at things like stress inoculation therapy, where you gradually expose people to the source of the stress, and they see over time with their own experience that there's no harm that comes to them. But some of the deeper challenges, like you described, Yvonne, like someone who may be trapped in a home where a spouse or a significant other has died, those are the more challenging aspects. And the things that we relied on there, things like cognitive processing therapy, where you look at really draws on the work of people like Viktor Frankl, where you have a significant trauma and how do you derive meaning from that trauma. And that can be a tough stretch, but in general, you deal with the premise that which doesn't kill me makes me stronger. And if I survived, whereas someone else is gone, what must I do to honor that legacy? So these are different manifestations of how you can deploy behavioral science in the workplace. But I wanted to touch on something that Anish and George were referencing, which is when you're dealing with communicating in the midst of a crisis, and indeed now in the wake of the crisis, it's really important to communicate values. And that hub and spoke mechanism that George referenced, George, the way I listen to that is that values are manifest both in what we say, but also what we do. So your employees can hear what you say, but ordinarily they see what you do, and they see the manifestations of what you do in the world. But that latter part was disrupted, right? And so how do you deal with that? And one of the things that we did there with our clients that had a large number of employees, it doesn't really work to have a Zoom meeting with me speaking and 1,000 people listening, because there's no interaction. So instead, what we do is we have me speaking, for example, to 12 people, and then those 12 people are speaking to 12 people, and those 12 people are speaking to 12 people. This cognitive apprenticeship model where you take the values that are manifest in speaking and they ripple out through the organization in that way. And that's something that we found that was efficient in the worst of the crisis.
Interesting. And the question, I mean, we talked about, you know, rethink our ethics and values, and then based on that, our corporate practices going forward. Who are we now? I mean, because the thing is, It's, again, I'm starting with you, Anish. I mean, this has changed you as a corporate executive, but I think it has also changed you, as a husband, as a father. You're not the same person that you were. I mean, and I'm just transposing, because I'm for sure not the same person, I was before COVID. And it has changed my relationship with my husband, and how we look at each other. It's changed my relationship with my employees. It's and how are we different, and what are our next steps?
Look, I think this has changed everyone, right? And so I think there are, again, several levels that this has to work at. If I speak first to your point as a personal level, it certainly changed me most probably as a father, because I've spent more time with my children, who are 5 and 9, in the last year and a half than I did in their whole lives before that totaled up, right? So that, that is now a different relationship, and so it has to be thought about differently. I think as the combination of our leaders kind of makes the culture of the company, and I think that's where, as a company, we are wrestling with what we really are. I will tell you that as retailers, and which is kind of the core ethos of our group, even though each maison is a little bit different, but as retailers, we are people who have to come together because first of all, that we still transact fundamentally in physical spaces, and we need to be able to observe that activity firsthand, support our teams. We can't have this. We don't believe. Others may differ. We don't believe we can have a culture where the executives can be super flexible and can work from home all the time, but our frontline team members have to be in the store all the time, because that's where the business takes place. So we feel like we need to have, a culture which will still have people in the office a lot in order to maintain a cohesive culture. But the third level is thinking about how our people have changed. And, this is something that I've been talking with other executives in retail about recently. For a lot of our frontline employees, their values have simply shifted. And they no longer have the same interest in the sort of equation of living and working in a big city in a retail trade for the kinds of hours, weekends, et cetera, that are required for that trade for the compensation that's offered there. And I think this is an extreme situation in hospitality. I think they're feeling it the most acutely, but retail's not terribly far behind. And so, I think that there's a real, we're just beginning to go through the period. I have a podcast that I like that calls it the Great Resignation, that we're going through, where, you're going to see a lot of people changing jobs. I don't know that it means wholesale flight out of one industry and into another, but I do think it's going to be a lot of churn. Basically, people are reevaluating their values, what it was before, what it is now, and what they want from there. And as organizations, we have to be ready to work through that.
Yeah. Have you already started with? I mean, your employees are your most valuable tool in your coffer, because they know the customers, and they know the product. They have integrated knowledge of the organization. So you don't want to have a lot of, although it's in retail, there's always turnover. But what are you doing to make your employees who are thinking about, is this what I want to do? How do you keep them on board? Do you have already a strategy for that, or are you leaving it to the managers to make sure they rally the troops?
For us, our culture is really maison by maison. So the answer is, I'm working with our leaders of the different maisons they are really the ones who are working through this and figuring it out, because it's a different answer for each particular company. But the first thing is to recognize that it's necessary, and I think there's a broad recognition that this is what's happening. I think it's important to note, though, that there's also the positive side of it, right? Which is talent is becoming available in the market that hadn't been before, because they were comfortable in what they were doing. And so the shift of values works in lots of different ways, and I don't think it's clear yet how it's going to play out. But I think for us, it's a strategy of making sure that our people feel like they are part of a culture that that still fits with their values, even as those may have shifted somewhat. But also that we're out there looking for people whose values, are now more aligned with ours than they might have been before, so we can figure out how to bring that talent in.
Interesting. The Georges, change in corporate, ethics, how we think about our role in society. What are you seeing in your work? Is that something that your clients are asking for to get help with, or what are you seeing?
Well, we are seeing several things, but and this is linked to the employees also. The clients are at the same time closer and further away. I cannot go and visit them, with few exceptions, but I can talk to them every week if I need to, which I wouldn't be doing before, especially when they are in India or in Europe, which is where most of our clients are. The social dimension is clearly surging, and we see that in the ESG practice, where everything was focused on environment, and now the social questions are being raised, and I think the debate is only starting. I'll just say one thing on this one, and this is because I was the head of international at the New York Stock Exchange, and I'm still very active in advisory in the capital market. I think there is a very serious societal debate that is creating a fracture in our society. And by the way, when we talk about Black Lives Matter and so on, I believe that we have to differentiate between race and the social situation. And the problem that I see at the moment is that the people who have been the most fragile are the ones who suffer the most. Let me give you one example. The level of employment for the mid-level and the top level is back to 2019. For the lower income, it's down 25%. It's a dramatic situation. But at the same time, yesterday, the Nasdaq was at its all-time high. The growth since the market dropped is sometimes 100%. I don't have to tell Anish how brilliantly LVMH stock has been moving in the last 2 to 3 years. And I'm not saying that that is illegitimate, but I'm just saying that it raises a question. Is our capitalist system, to use that word, basically only for a few or for a percentage of the population? And is the gap between those who are not part of it and those who are part of it not widening to a level where we have to consider that this issue is as much a survival issue for those who are in the low situation as it is for the corporates, because you cannot survive in society if, and I go back to something that Anish was saying, the people do not believe that they can trust the corporate world. And we have seen some data recently that the trust in the corporate world has not necessarily grown over the last pandemic. So we have to rebuild the trust. And that's a societal issue.
Yeah, and let me pick up on that. and it is also a question for Tom, but also both Tom and Anish. So how do we do that? I mean, how do we, define or rethink our role as companies, large and small, and the role that we need to play to pick up, the ones that came, fell through the cracks during this pandemic. Can we do something? And if so, what is it going to be? And can we actually act against it? Because I'm a little bit disappointed with the Black Lives Matter initiatives, and I've been corrected by a number of our members that that it's not just talk, but they're actually implementing against it, and it will just take some time, for this to push through. But are we rethinking our values as companies, how we play in society, or the role we have in society? And then, what concrete steps are we taking? Is this a discussion in the boardroom?
Well, if I may, Yvonne, earlier there was some discussion about how the pandemic changed us, and then it evolved a bit into how it's changed values. And I want to present a different perspective on that, which is that the pandemic may well have revealed values for people. And so I'll just start with an anecdotal example of myself, that I've always wanted to spend more time with my elderly mother. And during the pandemic, I did so. So it wasn't front of mind prior to the pandemic, but during the pandemic, it was manifest both in what I was thinking and what I was doing. And Anish referenced people in sectors, presumably including retail, that may have been comfortable in their roles before, but stayed in them. And that has the ring of a bad relationship, right? Like and so when there's a significant traumatic event happens, it may reveal your values in a different way that then prompts you to act. And perhaps you say, this life in retail or in hospitality isn't for me. But by the same token, it may well be for others whose values are revealed. And so I just think about I'm an optimist at heart, and I'll reveal that now by saying, to your question, what do we do? I think there was, prior to the pandemic, a movement towards broader social responsibility on the part of businesses. And there were some who said, this might just be a flash in the pan or a trend or something. And I think we're seeing the ascendance of that kind of behavior and those manifestations of values now. And I think as we emerge from that, that may become the dominant way of thinking in businesses. Because if those values are revealed by this trauma, well, there's an opportunity for them to manifest.
Anish, I know you care about this subject a lot, back from your time at McKinsey.
Yeah, look, first of all, I think, Tom is capturing something I was trying to point out, which is I think there is both risk and opportunity in this moment, as, and I like his framework of values being revealed. I think the role of our groups in society is I think, finally becoming more apparent, in that, for a long time, the big topic, one of the big social topics pre-pandemic was sustainability, right? And environmental sustainability. And I went to lots of conferences, and there were lots of meetings and lots of talk, and there were some metrics put out and all that stuff. But the thing that always struck me is whenever you did consumer research and you asked people if there were two products side by side that were completely equivalent, and one was made sustainably but cost 5% more, and the other one was not made sustainably but was 5% cheaper, the vast majority would choose the one that was cheaper. So there was a lot of talk about sustainability as a societal factor, but actually from the customer's own pocket, there wasn't any kind of imperative. I think that's now changing. I think now a combination of the values of our employees, but more importantly, the values of our customers, are now putting, and again, it's too soon to really get research on this, although we're working on it to try to confirm this. But I think now topics like sustainability, but also diversity and inclusion, not only at the executive level, but also in the products, in how they are portrayed, are now going to be real demand drivers. And personally, I think that's a good thing, because while I agree with George that the capitalist system has its flaws, it also has the benefit of being relatively efficient, in the sense that once people figure out that this is actually what's needed to be successful from a pure capitalist perspective, it will, I think, be the real catalyst for the social change that we need. So I'm also an optimist. I'm looking at this as, now we are going to actually be making doing some of the things that we've been talking about doing, and doing in small steps. I'm hoping we being the business community, not just our group, start making those in larger strides, because it turns out that that's actually the most rational thing to do from a business perspective.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, and I am myself also very optimistic that we're coming out of this. It will take some time, but we're coming out of this in a better way, because just a little anecdote where I 100% see exactly what you just said, the value of the customer. My husband and I live downtown, and the restaurants that we have in the neighborhood, I would say at least 70% of them survived much better than in Midtown. Obviously, in Midtown, you were missing all the business, lunches, but down here, everybody went out of their way who had still a salary to support these small restaurants, small stores. We all went out shopping and eating. I remember we were sitting there in the cold, in the rain, with under one of these sun umbrellas, just to eat out at that restaurant and keep them alive. And I really believe that this has, I don't want to say expedited, that's not the word, but it really has shown us as consumers that we can make a difference, and we should support, the organizations that we believe in. But that brings us back to, how do we communicate these ethics and the values? I mean, with a restaurant example, obviously these were all, restaurants that were part of the community down here. So it was easy for them to have that message. How do you present your company as part of the community, as part of this larger, larger picture, and make sure that people understand that, you're worth supporting, your employees have the buy-in, and get everybody on board for that. And that's probably a question both for Tom and for Anish.
I'll offer a quick thought, and then I'm sure Tom has much more articulate things to offer. I think it's about trying to make your values as transparent as possible. But you have this sort of touchstone, the word that's kind of become very popular in the last couple of years, of authenticity. Okay? So if I pick on one of our maisons at Sephora, Sephora was the first major retailer to take the 15% pledge last year and commit to having 15% of the shelf space reserved for Black-owned brands. Now, 1 year later, they are now in the cycle of regularly reporting on that, so that people actually can see, what's the progress towards that goal. And that's just one issue and one maison, and Sephora has, some other, programs that they work on. They are actually being honored by the Runway of Dreams Foundation for their work on inclusivity of people with disabilities. But again, it's not a marketing campaign. They actually designed their last 3 distribution centers such that about 10% of the jobs can be done by people who are fully hearing impaired. And you walk into the facility, you wouldn't know who are the people that are hearing impaired and who aren't, because it's been designed in to the structure. And so, I think the way you do it is you have to communicate the values very transparently, but you can't communicate them unless you're living them. And if you are living them and you're communicating them, then your audience that shares those values will find you.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, I don't know that I can be more articulate than that, Nish, but I appreciate the compliment. But I think both you and Yvonne spoke how you answer this challenge about communicating ethics and values, which is you speak them and you do them. And if we think of the pandemic as a revealing event, as I spoke of previously, that these values that were there but perhaps just not front of mind, and then along comes the pandemic and it exposes them. There's a core condition of the human species. In behavioral science, we call it the premise of insufficiency. And it's the fact that the way we have evolved as a species, we can't survive on our own. Like, we require others, interactions with others, to meet our survival needs, let alone fulfilling larger ambitions. That's always been there, but it was revealed by the pandemic, right? Like, boy, did we realize we need other people. And so you have this revealing event that gives us as business leaders and advisors to business leaders the opportunity to help people articulate and message their values. And now that the economy is reopening and as vaccines are rolled out here in the States and Western Europe, elsewhere, we have the ability to start doing them, to manifest them in actions, to do exactly as you did, Yvonne, which is to go out and patronize those businesses because that's a reflection of your particular values.
Yeah, so actionable business insights, and how do we, not make this a fluke, but really make sure that the learnings that we have, and that we can make them stick, and not fall back 6 months from now into our old patterns. Georges.
Yes. I would like to, first, I'm an optimist like everybody here. We know that from our previous conversations. I see some transformation of what comes out to us. More than 50% of the projects that we are working on are important from an impact standpoint. We have several projects. We have 10 projects in India. Some of them are in the environmental ESG financing. Some are in the healthcare, particularly in cancer. We have been working on the supply chain, trying to gradually work with New York City to have more barges to transport goods to New York City rather than the trucks, who are a major problem for environment, but also for a number of other things. And something that is very important is that we are now, and I think it's our role as bankers and advisors, we are now reaching out to investors, and we find out that investors are hungry for these kind of projects because they themselves have become much more sensitive to the impact and the purpose of what they are doing. And when you start talking about building a manufacturing capability in gene therapy for cancer in India, the community that you have around you is different. We are working on a project where we are going to have kiosks on schools following all the attacks that reduces the risk of hemorrhage and the risk of deaths of students. But the army is interested. The people on the sports ground are interested. So all of a sudden it becomes a movement, and there is a group called Stop the Bleeding. And so all those kind of things are now happening. And in that case, Yvonne, I believe that if those projects manage to find the right place in terms of funding, this is going to be sustainable. We now have to prove, because we all know what good feelings are. And back to what Anish was saying about the $5 or whatever. We now have audiences of people who really want those projects to happen, who come with those projects, and they are financeable. And our role is to find where are the pockets of money and the investors who are really motivated by profitable but impact activities. And that is sustainable.
That's great. That's great. I also I'm excited about the fact that you know, I mean, and I saw it with in a small level at EACC, how willing we all of a sudden are were to innovate, to try new things, and I really believe that that is going to stay with us as well. We are much more willing to think outside of the box and try something. If it's not working, fine, you know, no big deal. We're gonna do it for 6 months and then drop it and try something new. But Anish inspired me with some of the stories, you know, that his employees have done, and how when retail wasn't available, how they interacted with the customers, and it's not only in the luxury space. This can be done on a you know, on a local level. We had that literally. I told you in one of the calls before, I was pedaling up with my bicycle on Mulberry, and there were all these small little boutiques who found a way to get their customers in there. Masks, you know, wipes and what have you, one at a time, but they found a way to open. And I think that is definitely, you know, we always said we're ready to innovate, but I don't think that we ever innovated as much as we did in the last 18 months. And I definitely think that this is something that will stay with us. I would like to do a quick round. We have 7 minutes left, and give all of you an opportunity for final thoughts and what you're hoping the change will be that this pandemic initiated. Who wants to start?
Well, I'll step in and say, in response to your question earlier, Yvonne, that how do we prevent ourselves from going back to our old ways? I think the genie is out of the bottle, and there is no going back. And if you look at other major global traumas, and in your opening remarks, you made reference to some, I can't remember if it was World War I or
9/11.
Yeah, if you look at, for example, just take one of those, World War I. You know, it began and it ended, and the world existed one way before World War I. But at the conclusion of World War I, the world never went back. If you look at the upheaval and the changes in the social structure in places like the United Kingdom, for instance, things never went back to the way they were. And so we've spent a lot of time in this discussion talking about the emergence of values. My perspective is that values have been revealed. I don't have a monopoly on the truth. Perhaps they have shifted, but they're in the forefront in ways that they weren't before. We reference social movement, we reference social responsibility, and I think all of that is going to be a defining feature of the post-pandemic changes that are here to stay.
You know, I think Tom is right that there is no going back to some extent, but it's it's been fascinating personally to observe how old habits try to come back, and how, you know, I almost have to work actively against them. So, you know, took my first business trip and all of a sudden started realizing that I was booking a, you know, ridiculous itinerary that was going to have me, you know, waking up early, getting home late, not seeing my kids, et cetera, et cetera. And so had to actively rethink that, because these muscles are just out of use. And so my hope is that, you know, we are all able to have the perspective to, you know, take advantage of the good things we learned during this troubled time, and make those changes in our personal lives, in our organizations and cultures. And I think therefore, you know, those will in turn drive changes in our companies that will yield to positive overall change in the society and the economy.
Josh?
I think Thomas has said something very important earlier, and Anish confirmed it. One thing that needs to accompany all the progress that we see and the lessons that we learned from this period and transform them into action is the way we communicate. And where I follow a little bit what Anish was saying is that it's going to be a fight. For professional reasons and my experience at the New York Stock Exchange, I can tell you one thing. Wall Street continues to sing the exact same song as if nothing had happened. We are in a system where we will have to fight to be authentic in the way we communication, because it's not going to be well received. And I think there are some issues about how the media have handled the pandemic, the way they spread fear, anxiety, and everything that will need to be recognized. So it is a major undertaking. I am convinced that at least some elements of it are going to be there for the long term, but I am acutely aware of the forces that are going to publicly or under the cover continue, like what is happening on the cryptocurrencies that are basically a Ponzi scheme with no social value, but excite the media and people and the kids on Millennium and so on. So there is one part of society that doesn't want to learn about it. And I think that this is going to be a challenge. And voices like the one of Anish and Thomas are absolutely critical, because we cannot let the communication be occupied by the old voices. And I can tell you one thing, the media have not changed.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, they're selling hype, and with that advertisement, and it's all about the eyeballs. But I have to say, I'm I'm encouraged talking when I'm talking to executives, members of the EICC, that that leaders have changed, executives have changed. And by leaders, I also mean not only CEOs, also managers. There has been a realization that we can't continue on the rat race, or whatever you want to call it. It's all about me, that we were on before. And that's something we are, like, I think Tom said it, we're all in this together, and we need to solve and be better in this together. And I really believe that, I mean, I agree with you, Josh. Not everybody is on board for this quite yet, but I think there are enough of us who come to that realization, and maybe with the realization, like Anish just said, he's not going to book, 8 to 8 schedule. but leaves, a couple of, an hour in between to sit in the Jardin de Luxembourg when he's next time in Paris and write a postcard to his kids. I think there are enough people out there who are going to, lead the change and make this a thing for the future.
I just would like to say, we all know that we cannot take it for granted. It is going to be a fight.
Yeah, no, for sure. Anish?
I hope that's the plan.
Yeah, it's not only hope, it's the plan. Very good. So, I like to have, it's not hope, it's the plan, to be the final word on our webinar. And because we reached the 11 o'clock mark. And I would like to thank all of you to join us today and share your thoughts. I thought it was a really interesting discussion. And let's make, the hope, the plan all together and come out of this better. I'm really, I'm quite bullish on that. I think it's going to happen because this was so traumatic that, if you haven't realized that something needs to change, I don't know where you've been the last 18 months. So we will put a record. This webinar was recorded. We will have it up on our website if you want to, share it with a couple of friends who haven't been able to attend. And again, thank you to our panel for joining us.